really need to make sure that the market remains competitive for the sake of creativity, but for the sake of consumers as well. I think that the job of the fashion industry and of the law, as we know, is to balance the rights of creatives and the rights of brands with the ability to foster innovation.
Hello, I'm Bruce Berman, the host of Understanding IP Matters, the critically acclaimed podcast series that provides leading innovators and experts a space to share their IP story. Learn firsthand about the strengths and weaknesses of copyrights, patents, trademarks, and trade secrets as they adapt to an AI-driven world. This is our 4th season. Like music, inventions, and other forms of creativity, fashion draws on the work of others. Just how much is the subject of heated debate and costly disputes. With a background in business and law, Julie Zerbo, editor-in-chief of The Fashion Law, the industry daily she founded as a student, has worked with brands ranging from early-stage design companies to luxury goods. Julie has a deep understanding of consumer culture and IP rights and is a frequent speaker at businesses, law firms, and universities. Julie's breakthrough moment was an article calling out Chanel's fall 2012 bracelets, which looked alarmingly similar to the work of an emerging popular designer, Pamela Love. Chanel posted an apology within 48 hours. Welcome, Julie. Where are you speaking from today?
I'm in New York. Thank you for having me.
It's good to have you here. Your approach to fashion is not typical. A lot can be learned from the way you remind people that fashion is a business that includes both creativity and property. How did you come to this perspective?
I think you kind of nailed it there. I certainly don't approach fashion in the way that maybe some others do. I didn't anticipate when I set out in my career and when I went to law school that I would be working in fashion. I certainly don't have a background in fashion. My background is in economics, international business, and then in law. That is the lens that I use to look at retail and consumer goods and really products, services of all types. That to me is what I think is particularly interesting, this marriage of business and intellectual property and this giant industry of retail of consumer goods, and there's a lot of crossover that keeps me busy, certainly, but also dovetails neatly into all sorts of litigation and filings of all types.
Many casual observers think fashion is similar to tech, with the biggest players holding the most leverage. I'm sure that's true to some extent, and IP rights insufficient to protect smaller players. Is that accurate?
If we're looking at the luxury goods industry, I think that as consolidation of groups has continued to flourish, it's certainly true. It feels like the playing field is a bit uneven because groups like LVMH, which owns 70 plus brands, Louis Vuitton, Dior, Givenchy, Loewe, but then also Moet and Hennessy and a ton of brands in between are really robust machines that have significant power when it comes to real estate transactions, employment, and also trademark filing and enforcement. And so I think that IP is an option for brands regardless of their size, assuming that filing fees are not cost prohibitive. But I think where we're seeing kind of a really obvious unevenness in the playing field is how companies can actually enforce their rights if they do have rights. It's really difficult, even if you have, I would say, a slam dunk of a trademark infringement case. It's really difficult for a small brand to go up against the likes of LVMH or Nike or Adidas, or I'm really just throwing out big names here. But I think that's where the inequality is really glaring.
Whether it's copyright or a patent, it's 100% of something, but you have to be able to enforce it. You can't dial 911 and say, arrest that person. He's stealing my IP.
Right. And I think one place where a lot of smaller companies don't allocate funds often is to their legal department. And so while they might have trademark registrations, copyright registrations, design patents, it's difficult for them to enforce them to the extent that litigation requires.
Beyond brand licensing, Julie, is there much the fashion industry can do to protect designs through patents, copyrights, trade secrets? Shoe designer Christian Louboutin, his infamous red shoe soles are protected only under trademark, as I understand it. There's no functionality associated with them that I'm aware of, or unique design elements. Are they diminished in value and power because of that lack of IP coverage?
That's certainly an interesting example because it's one of the most famous uses of color as an indicator of source in fashion, I would argue. We have other examples, ranging from Hermes orange product packaging to even UPS workers, brown uniforms. We see color used a lot and quite powerfully across industries. And I think that we're seeing a little bit of an uptick in brands trying to lean into signature colors because the market is so branded. Consumers are so used to seeing traditional branding that I think that some companies are trying to, one, bolster their arsenal of rights by leaning heavily into color, but also trying to reach consumers in a slightly different way and using trademark to do so. I think that the fact that obviously Louboutin's not claiming, rightfully, function in the color is certainly meaningful, but also I think it's an interesting one because in the case that Louboutin filed against Yves Saint Laurent, which really brought, I think, the color to the world stage from a trademark perspective, the registration was modified after the case was filed to only protect a red sole on a shoe that is not otherwise red, primarily for functionality purposes or, for competitiveness in the industry. The court said, other companies might want to use red on a shoe. You can't monopolize that.
Borrowing has always been a part of many types of creative expression. Music, films, food, even books borrow. Authors borrow. Often it's subconscious. How is borrowing recognized in fashion?
I think this is interesting because I would say, like you mentioned, borrowing is not novel, no pun intended. It's not specific to the fashion industry by any means. I think that, like music, like film, fashion operates from a point of kind of a shared cultural language, right? We're using sampling in music, we're using homage in cinema. Fashion draws and is really heavily reliant on past styles, on subculture, on other designs that exist to some extent because there's only so much novelty when you're talking about a pair of pants. I think in addition to this reality of there being a shared cultural language in fashion, just like there is in film and music, I think that there is an element of not appropriation, but inspiration that runs through creative fields, whether that be music or fashion. And so I don't think fashion is different in that way. It's not removed from the cultural zeitgeist. And so we see borrowing there. If we're thinking about how fashion is unique, though, when it comes to borrowing, I mean, certainly, filmmakers make money from movies and artists make money from songs, but I think fashion is much more commercial at its core. The bulk of the fashion and apparel and footwear that we're seeing on the market, I think certainly we could talk about couture and handmade bespoke pieces, but the vast majority of what we're seeing is made to be sold and it's made to be sold in bulk. And I think that changes the conversation to some extent when we think about borrowing.
That's a great point. There are a couple of different industries here. The creativity of couture is one thing, but when you're in business to manufacture millions of pieces of something, it's another kind of perspective.
Right. And I think that to some extent, the the legal treatment of fashion differs to some extent from other forms of art because of the functionality at play. No matter how creative a shirt is, has a function.
Still a shirt.
Yeah, you need to wear pants out of the house. You need to wear shoes. And so that you can't divorce that from the products we're talking about. And the law recognizes that, right? The law knows you can't claim a monopoly on pants. That's not good for the market. We don't actually want that. That's not a policy we can get behind.
Does AI play a role or will it play a role in fashion, in creation and manufacture? What are you seeing?
Yes, we're seeing it. It's interesting. We've been seeing it, and as consumers, we've been engaging with it, whether we know or not. We're seeing it. If you're on a website and you're talking in a chat box on that site, you are most likely talking to an AI agent. So we have uses like that are just very functional and consumer facing. We also have the use of AI in other behind the scenes capacities when it comes to distribution. We have AI in factories, we have AI helping to localize products. When it comes to, I guess, the more creative side, we are seeing AI used in marketing. There's some artists out there right now. I wrote an article about one not too long ago that are using AI to create advertising campaigns that you would not know are created by AI. I would say that, these are really sophisticated campaigns and they've come quite a bit from some of the early generative AI campaigns that we first saw that were not quite up to snuff, in my opinion. So we're seeing it in marketing. We're certainly seeing it in design, and it's helping speed up design. It's helping cut costs. I think that, where we're really, really seeing it is being used to boost efficiency. So not very sexy ways at the moment at fashion brands.
But still meaningful.
Yeah, yeah, certainly meaningful. And then I think one interesting place that's getting quite a bit of buzz for obvious reasons is the use of AI generated models. Levi Strauss rolled out an initiative with AI generated models and got a lot of flack for it because there were concerns about, what about real models? They need to work. And what are the diversity implications here? And so we really are seeing it kind of across the board, and it raises some interesting legal questions in the process.
Interesting. Well, China, for example, doesn't care much about IP rights, at least our IP rights associated with fashion, nor do many domestic competitors. But in France and Italy, where fashion is a major industry, bigger than ours, there seems to be more effective enforcement of design and proprietary rights. Did you see that?
I do. I think, we've seen cases play out in France and the United States, for instance, and the outcomes can be quite different, which is interesting and really demonstrative of some of the robustness of the protections for brands in France, versus the United States. I think that obviously the law is much more well established there because originality in the fashion industry has a much richer history in countries like France, in countries like Italy versus the United States, which was essentially, a licensing home for a very long time. We are still, I would say, behind in terms of the number of brands versus high fashion brands, at least versus France and Italy, and then also in terms of manufacturing capabilities. And so the law is much more well established. I think that, one piece that's particularly interesting to me is kind of the moral rights element or the parrotism element that is much stronger and favors famous brands much more in France. I think if Louis Vuitton were to file a lawsuit in France claiming that their brand reputation is being damaged, they're much more likely to see a favorable outcome in France than in the United States.
There is this idea that all copies are fakes. Tell us a little bit about the difference between so-called legal knockoffs and counterfeits.
This is a very timely question in the market right now, where we are constantly seeing products referred to as dupes, short for duplicates, a term that originally referred to legal knockoffs, legal fakes, products that were just purely inspired by other products. So we first really saw it in the cosmetics industry, where retail chains like CVS or other pharmacies were seeing expensive skincare products, formulating their own similar-ish product and maybe taking some of the elements of the product packaging, but not engaging in trade dress infringement or anything like that. And that carried on for years. And now we're in 2025, and the thing that is often referred to as a dupe, it is a counterfeit good. We've gone from taking inspiration from existing products and calling it a dupe to, replicating a Gucci bag, logo and all, and calling it a dupe. And it's certainly not a dupe. In theory, a legally above board knockoff or replica does not replicate a company's registered trademark and a trademark registered for the type of goods that it's being used on. That's a counterfeit good. And certainly it shouldn't be an infringement. So a replication of a logo or a confusingly similar logo on some related type of goods or service. So there is really a gray area right now, not legally speaking, but in terms of the terminology that we're using. And I think it's meaningful from a consumer perception perspective. I think that there used to be, in my opinion, a much ickier approach to carrying a fake bag, for instance. There used to be a stigma. You didn't really want anybody to know if you're carrying a counterfeit bag. I think it's part of a much larger conversation, but I think that younger consumers, young millennials, definitely Gen Z, don't necessarily see the value in paying the enormous price tags that come with, let's talk about luxury bags, for instance. Companies are raising prices and raising prices, and consumers are not necessarily, I would say, head over heels.
What's a Birkin bag these days? $8,000 or $9,000 or something?
More if you, I mean, if you can get one from the brand, it will cost more. You can buy one from a reseller, but they're similarly expensive. And I think that consumers are just a bit disenchanted.
And there's also the other intangible. If you're walking in the streets, you're a New Yorker with a potentially $10,000 bag, and a lot of the people who would rob you, they know that's a real one. You're kind of a target with that kind of a bag. You see a lot of backpacks for people who can afford a lot more.
Yeah, I think it's a complex situation for brands. I think that there's questions to be asked about, are these price increases really worth it at a certain point?
Well, now you have an interesting marketing. I'm not a great student of this, but I couldn't help but see it. Swatch, which owns a lot of premium brands, Movado and Bouger, and those are really, pretty high-end watches. They came out with a line of their own dupes. So here are less expensive versions of those, which aren't that inexpensive, but certainly reasonable before others might. I thought that's a really cool, savvy marketing strategy. We're going to knock off our own stuff and sell it at a slight premium.
So I think Lululemon might be up to something creative as well. I wrote not that long ago, they filed a trademark application on an intent to use basis. So I don't know what's going on, but it's a word mark for Lululemon dupe.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and the backstory there is that they are one of the most heavily duped brands out there. Their leggings are relatively expensive. And so, other companies, including on Amazon, are having a heyday creating pants that look like Lululemon, but that don't use the word Lululemon or the Lululemon logo. So these are dupes, assuming they don't use any of the technology that would be design patent protected. Recognizing this and seemingly wanting to insert themselves in the zeitgeist, they opened a pop up in one of their stores in Los Angeles for 2 days where they called on consumers that had dupes of their Align leggings and said, bring them into our store, give us your dupes, and we'll give you an authentic pair. It's one of the ways that companies are responding. A lot of companies are just ignoring that dupes are happening because, stuff like this has been happening for as long as trademarks have existed. But some companies are trying to get involved. I also think that this is really, it's not just a trademark issue, it's a marketing issue. It's a marketing case study in many regards. And I think that when it comes to luxury brands, there are questions to be asked about, is there reliance on heritage marketing and, made in Italy or made in France labels, which has driven their prestige and their pricing power for so long? Is that speaking to younger consumers if they want the look of a product and don't necessarily need the logo
I'm hacking an expensive purchase here.
and being proud of it?
The fashion law was started by you in law school as a sort of hobby, and it takes no advertising. How did you build it, and who are the readers?
So I would not advise other first year law students to take time away from studying and start a blog.
By the way, I've been reading it, and it's really very well done, I must say. It's very accessible to non-fashion people, to non-legal people. It's really timely and interesting and seemingly very objective. It seems like you're really trying hard to cover the industry in ways that others don't.
Yes, thank you. It's grown a lot, both in size, but also subject matter since I started writing about fashion law exclusively in my first year of law school. I identified that I was very interested in the marriage of intellectual property and this massive industry that is fashion and retail. It seemed like interesting opportunity for research and writing. And so that's how it started. And I kept it up in varying capacities while I was in law school studying for the bar when I certainly shouldn't have been writing. Taking that and working in a semi traditional legal capacity thereafter. But I kept coming back to the site because our traffic was growing and people were really responding to this content. And I've been continually driven by my own desire to research and analyze this industry, with that industry growing from just fashion to consumer goods more broadly, footwear, tech. We write an increasing amount about the auto industry because there are protections to discuss there. And we also talk a lot and analyze a lot of the business side of things. It's not by any means just a legal site anymore. It's impossible for me to look at any of this from a purely legal perspective. I think it has to be supplemented by the business reality and the business case and strategy as well. And so that's why our readers really range from in-house counsel at big luxury brands, and our privacy policy doesn't let me say who they are, big luxury brands to auto brands to tech companies. I'm consistently surprised by the scope of our readership. But then, so we have in-house counsel, we have lawyers at firms, but then we have business folks at consultancies, at companies, professors, students, students in law school and business school. It really is a resource. That's certainly how I look at it, but hopefully it's a bit entertaining as well.
You mentioned the auto industry. I had an interview with the design patent lawyer at Finnegan Henderson, and she said they're making frequent use now of design patents, especially on spare parts. How come the fashion industry hasn't used design patents very much?
So they have, but not, I suspect, with the frequency and robustness as the auto industry. And one of the reasons is the difference in the lifespan of a traditional fashion product versus a traditional auto product. Traditional fashion product, a seasonal one is out in the market for 6 months, if I'm being generous. A car part, much longer, especially if we're talking about an engine or something in a Tesla that in theory doesn't have to be replaced terribly often. I'm a New Yorker and not a car owner, so I'm a little bit out of my depth here. However, where we see design patents used increasingly in the fashion industry are for staple products. So the bags, the shoes, the jewelry that will sell for a longer period of time or in higher quantities. So if a company thinks, this new bag that we are introducing is going to be our next it bag. We're putting a ton of marketing behind this. We are getting the most famous people to carry it. We'll invest.
Yeah, it's not that much money.
For small brands, it is, but for bigger companies, no. And so that's why we are seeing design patents used quite a bit more.
Is there a place for small designers today? Do they have more leverage than in the past, or is it still, really the small designer against the big couture brand?
I think it's different. I think it's different than it used to be. I think it's still very difficult to compete in certain ways. It's difficult to the best real estate, for instance, in shopping capitals because conglomerates own real estate. They own the stores and they own the complexes in which their stores are located, the malls in which their stores are located. It's difficult to get prime marketing placement, advertising placement, because the biggest spenders get priority. So it's difficult in that sense. But social media, the rise of e-commerce, these things have even the playing field to some extent. It's not unheard of for a small company to be worn by a celebrity and blow up overnight. Social media has kind of democratized the market to some extent and allowed smaller companies to have a platform that they never would have been able to afford in the past. There's that. And then I think that, like we kind of touched on before, younger consumers are not, I don't think, as equally enchanted by big conglomerate owned brands than maybe consumers were in the past. I mean, just before this call, I was writing an article about how one of Valentino Garavani, the Italian luxury company, one of their units in Italy is allegedly subcontracting the manufacturing of its bags to Chinese owned factories in Milan that have been tied to labor abuses. And so consumers are reading these things. These are headline making stories that consumers are reading. And I don't think they're immune to wondering, if this bag cost $3,000, but I'm reading here that it cost 100 euros to make. Am I getting duped here?
Yeah, it's the whole cosmetics industry to some extent.
Yeah, I think that with things like TikTok, these stories do so well on TikTok. Consumers are really getting so much information.
Julie, you've told interviewers that you are not terribly interested in fashion for yourself. Are you concerned that if you wear a designer in public or a brand, it will be seen as some kind of an endorsement?
I don't think that because I don't view myself as an influencer by any means. I never have. the way that I've run my company from day one is that we don't take gifts. We don't engage in a lot of the stuff that magazines do or other outlets do. I view the fashion law as a professional resource that our readers can trust for objectivity, for accurate information, and for consistency, and also as a place where you can come and learn kind of what other professionals are thinking about, get ahead. And so we're not really in the business of advertising anything. And that applies to me too. Also, I'm a mom. I don't think anyone cares what I'm out wearing.
Ah, you've been quoted as saying, Julie, that quote, every time I write an article I'm really excited about, it makes me more and more unemployable. What do you mean by that?
I think I used to think that maybe one day I would actually practice again in a traditional capacity. That ship has sailed. I'm really most interested in being an analyst. That to me is really, I think, what my calling is. But I think that for a for a while there, I was writing things that were very opinion based, calling out companies for instances that I viewed as infringement. There's still an undercurrent of my thoughts in all of the pieces that I write.
Sure, it's impossible not to be. To me, Julie, you're like the Kara Swisher of fashion.
Oh, wow.
You know Kara Swisher. Now, for those who don't know who Kara Swisher is, she's a veteran reporter for the Wall Street Journal and Washington Post, covering technology and Silicon Valley in particular. She's not afraid to call out the biggest, baddest behaving players when necessary. And she's not looking to curry favor. She's not looking for a job. She's seeking the truth in an industry that is not used to dealing with it. Fashion needs this sort of oversight as well.
Fashion definitely needs oversight, and I think it's coming to some extent. I think that fashion needs oversight from a certainly there is oversight when we're talking about infringement of any kind. There's litigation. I think that one place where fashion really needs oversight is manufacturing, production, and really the end of life for products, for sustainability. This is one of the most polluting industries that we have. And for a long time, and still, frankly, today, companies have marketed themselves as ethical, as sustainable, as eco-friendly, and it isn't often true. And that's one place where the law has lagged. Legislation is coming in Europe mostly, and trying to hold companies accountable for the just enormous amount of emissions and waste that they cause. So this is one place where the fashion industry and really all industries have been able to operate in a wild west, but it's one place where oversight is really needed.
You've said that transparency is lacking, and I guess by that you mean part of the ecology of products and where they wind up. And I don't think you mean transparency in the gowns themselves, although at Cannes they did put in a rule: there's no nudity at Cannes. And it's funny because in the 50s they kind of promoted the semi-nudity that became de rigueur.
I think that the most obvious place for me where we need transparency is in supply chains for companies. As companies and fashion brands are enormous companies that have supply chains and value chains that are sweeping. These are multinational, consist of oftentimes contractors and subcontractors. And there's a lot of opaqueness how products end up in the hands of consumers. And that's something where the law is luckily stepping in slowly. But that's what I mean when I say we need transparency. We need to know where the cotton that our shirt is made from comes from. Is it the result of forced labor in China? What does the supply chain look like? And there is technology that is coming too. I think that, we need law and we need technology.
You need sort of provenance. You need to sort of track that product. They could do that digitally now with content, but maybe we'll do that digitally too with products, with the materials that go into products.
Yeah, that there are so many startups trying to figure that out as we speak.
Well, we're getting towards the end of our time. We like to ask our guests on Understanding IP Matters, what was your first exposure to IP rights, and was it positive or negative?
My first exposure was probably Barbie, and not the Barbie movie recently, although that was certainly that was a case study in itself of brilliant trademarks, copyright, marketing. I thought about that a lot, not this past summer, but the summer before. But I think unknowingly, I was exposed to a massive franchise built on IP when I came in contact with Barbie for the first time, that I only think I understood the scope of as an adult, but it was a positive one. There were all of these products marketed, and that I think I understood as coming from a single source. I didn't know as a 6-year old that I was experiencing the tenet of trademark law, but I guess I was.
Final question. How can the fashion industry use IP rights to encourage creativity and fairness?
I think that depends on how far courts allow companies to potentially overexpand their rights. That's something I'm seeing a lot. Companies, big companies that have trademarks, probably the most obvious here, trademark portfolios that they're consistently trying to push the limits of by targeting companies. I won't name names, but there are obvious ones in footwear and sportswear, in fashion as well, that have rights that they are, in theory, overextending, and taking on other, oftentimes smaller companies to stop their use of marks that the larger companies claim are infringing, but I'm not actually sure that they are. And then we're also seeing that we're seeing it in the US, we're seeing it in Europe too, where footwear companies a lot we're seeing it with are claiming they have rights in these designs that are actually composed largely of functional or otherwise generic elements. And so I think that we really need to make sure that the market remains competitive for the sake of creativity, but for the sake of consumers as well. This is something that I think about. The Fashion Law is actually putting together a conference as we speak for the fall. And this is something that we're addressing because it's important. I think that the job of the fashion industry and of the law, as we know, is to balance the rights of creatives and the rights of brands with the ability to foster innovation.
Where do you think it'll be held?
It's going to be in New York. It's on October 9th. Right now, we are finalizing all of our speakers and our panel topics. But I know that we're going to be talking about what IP and what branding looks like in 2025. What are some of the unique opportunities and challenges? Where are we going in terms of retail? How important is engagement in the secondary market? How important is circularity? And what does that look like actually at a brand, at a resale platform? And then also, I'm secretly, or probably not so secretly, obsessed with the role of marketing. So, what does marketing look like today? How are big brands falling short? What are they doing wrong? I think they're missing the mark in many ways. And so these are all things that we're going to talk about.
Sounds fascinating. And this was fascinating. We're out of time, but this was wonderful. Thanks for taking the time as a young mother and juggling a lot of things and editorial as well. Come back again, please.
My pleasure. Please have me back and come to the conference, Bruce.
Thank you. Understanding IP Matters is brought to you by the nonprofit Center for Intellectual Property Understanding with the generous support of its partners and sponsors. Gain access to all 4 seasons by subscribing for free on your favorite platform or email us at explore.understandingip.org. Content conveyed is for informational purposes only and does not represent the views of CIPU or its affiliates. This episode was produced by Jack Shields for Wild Creek Studios. Thank you for listening.